Hashtag the royal inbreeding catastrophe, a genetic tragedy across dynasties. The mirror doesn't lie, even when you wish it would. You see yourself reflected in its cold surface. But something is terribly wrong. Your jaw juts out so far that your mouth cannot close. Drool pulls at the corners of your lips as you struggle to form words that others can understand. Your enlarged tongue fills your mouth like a foreign object, making every meal an ordeal of careful positioning and slow, labored chewing. Your spine curves unnaturally, forcing your head into an awkward angle that makes you appear shorter than you already are. You are Charles II of Spain, and you are dying. It is November 1700, and you are 38 years old, though your body bears the accumulated damage of centuries. Your limbs shake with palsy, your skin is pale and waxy. Your bulging eyes, those distinctive Habsburg eyes that mark you as surely as a brand, stare back at you with the dull confusion that has plagued your entire reign. You cannot produce children. You cannot properly govern. You can barely eat solid food. And you know with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to the dying that this is not your fault. Your suffering stems from a single horrifying truth. Every drop of blood in your veins has been poisoned by the choices of your ancestors. For 16 generations, your family has married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, brother to sister in their obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. They called it maintaining divine right. They called it preserving their sacred Habsburg heritage. What they created was you, the final broken end point of the most extreme genetic experiment in human history. Hashtag the Spanish Habsburg Dynasty, a study in genetic catastrophe. Our story begins in 1516 when the House of Habsburg first took control of Spain. What followed was nearly 2 centuries of the most systematic inbreeding program ever attempted by a royal family. The Spanish Habsburgs didn't just occasionally marry cousins. They made it their defining characteristic. Of the 11 marriages contracted by Spanish Habsburg monarchs between 1450 and 1661, 9 were between blood relatives. Uncle married niece. First cousins wed first cousins. In some cases, the genetic overlap was so extreme that children were born with inbreeding coefficients approaching those of siblings. The men who ruled during this period weren't the strong, decisive monarchs that royal propaganda portrayed. They were the victims of their own family's genetic obsessions. Each generation more damaged than the last. Hashtag Charles I, the foundation of disaster. Charles of Spain, also known as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, seemed like an unlikely candidate for our story. Born in 1500, he inherited the largest empire in European history, stretching from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to southern Italy. He was intelligent, politically astute, and initially healthy. But look closely at his portraits, and you begin to see the warning signs. Antonio de Bettis, an Italian diplomat who met Charles in 1517, described him as having a long cadaverous face and a lopsided mouth which drops open when he is not on his guard. Charles had inherited the beginning of what would become known as the Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible that made his mouth hang open when he wasn't consciously controlling it. Charles had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.038, relatively low for his family, but already higher than what would be considered safe in any normal bloodline. His parents were cousins, but distantly related compared to the unions that would follow. The real tragedy of Charles I wasn't his own suffering, but his decisions about marriage. Despite ruling an empire that spanned continents, despite having access to potential brides from across Europe, Charles chose to marry his cousin Isabel of Portugal. Isabel's mother was Charles's aunt, his father's sister. The couple was so closely related that they needed special papal dispensation to wed. Their son, the future Philip II, would inherit not just the Spanish Empire, but an even more concentrated dose of Habsburg genetic damage. Charles abdicated in 1556. Worn down by the burden of ruling his vast territories and by the growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with his bloodline, he retired to a monastery where he spent his final years in prayer and contemplation, perhaps seeking divine forgiveness for the genetic catastrophe he had helped perpetuate. Hashtag Philip II, the zealot's burden. Philip II inherited the Spanish throne at its zenith of power, but he also inherited a genetic legacy that would define his entire reign. Born in 1527, Philip exhibited the classic Habsburg features from an early age: the elongated face, the hooded eyes, and the increasingly prominent jaw that made eating and speaking difficult. But Philip's genetic inheritance went beyond physical deformity. Modern historians believe he suffered from severe depression and possibly autism spectrum disorders, conditions that made him obsessively focused on detail, but incapable of the broad strategic thinking his empire required. Philip's approach to governance reflected the mental rigidity that often accompanies inbreeding depression. He became fixated on religious orthodoxy, launching the Spanish Inquisition with unprecedented brutality. He spent hours each day reading and responding to administrative minutiae while neglecting crucial strategic decisions. His advisors reported that he would sometimes spend an entire day crafting a single letter, rewriting it multiple times to achieve what he considered perfect wording. The tragedy of Philip II wasn't just personal. It was imperial. His genetic limitations contributed to Spain's decline as a global power. While more flexible rulers might have adapted to changing circumstances, Philip's rigid thinking led to disastrous wars in the Netherlands, the failed invasion of England, and economic policies that bankrupted the Spanish treasury. Philip married 4 times, desperately seeking male heirs to secure the succession. His first wife, Maria of Portugal, was his cousin. Their mothers were sisters. When Maria died young, Philip married Mary Tudor of England in a political alliance. That marriage produced no children. His third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, was unrelated to the Habsburg line, and their children were healthier than average for the dynasty. But for his fourth and final marriage, Philip returned to the family tradition. He married his niece Anna of Austria, daughter of his brother Maximilian II. Anna was 22 years younger than Philip and was literally his brother's daughter. Their union produced Philip III, who would carry even more concentrated Habsburg genes into the next generation. Philip III, the pious fool. Philip III, born in 1578, represented everything wrong with the Habsburg approach to monarchy. Contemporary accounts describe him as mentally slow, physically weak, and utterly dependent on advisors to make even basic decisions. His inbreeding coefficient was so high that modern geneticists consider it remarkable that he survived to adulthood. Philip III's physical appearance shocked even courtiers accustomed to Habsburg peculiarities. His jaw protruded so severely that he couldn't properly close his mouth. He drooled constantly and had such difficulty chewing that his food had to be pre-cut into tiny pieces. His speech was nearly incomprehensible, slurred by his malformed mouth and enlarged tongue. But perhaps more tragic than his physical deformities were his mental limitations. Philip III was described by contemporaries as having the mental capacity of a child. He was deeply religious, but in a superstitious way that suggested cognitive impairment rather than genuine spirituality. He believed in omens, spent hours each day in prayer, and left the actual governing of Spain to a series of favorites who exploited his weakness for their own benefit. The economic and political decline of Spain accelerated under Philip III's reign, while he focused on religious ceremonies and court etiquette. Spain lost control of the Netherlands, saw its American colonies become increasingly independent, and faced multiple bankruptcies. The empire that had dominated Europe for a century began its irreversible decline under a king who couldn't understand the complexities of governing. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, yes, another cousin, and their children represented the next stage in the Habsburg genetic experiment. Their son, the future Philip IV, would inherit an even more concentrated dose of the family's genetic defects. Philip IV, the melancholy king. Philip IV, born in 1605, ruled Spain for 44 years, one of the longest reigns in Spanish history. But length didn't equal quality. Philip IV presided over the continued decline of Spanish power while struggling with his own genetic inheritance. Diego Velázquez's portraits of Philip IV show us exactly what centuries of inbreeding had produced. The king had the classic Habsburg features taken to an extreme: the protruding jaw, the elongated skull, the hooded eyes that seemed to stare with vacant incomprehension. His auburn hair framed a face that contemporary observers described as melancholy and distant. Philip IV suffered from severe depression, what modern psychiatrists would recognize as major depressive disorder with possible psychotic features. Court records describe periods when the king would remain in his chambers for weeks at a time, refusing to see visitors or attend to state business. During these episodes, he would sometimes talk to paintings as if they were real people or become convinced that courtiers were plotting against him. The king's mental state wasn't helped by the constant pressure to produce a male heir. His first wife, Isabella of Bourbon, was a cousin, and their marriage produced several children who died in infancy or childhood. Only one daughter, Maria Theresa, survived to adulthood, but as a female, she couldn't inherit the Spanish throne. When Isabella died in 1644, Philip IV faced a crisis. He needed a male heir, but his genetic inheritance made healthy childbearing increasingly unlikely. Following family tradition, he married his niece, Mariana of Austria. Mariana was his brother's daughter, making their union one of the closest blood relationships in Habsburg history. The marriage between Philip IV and his niece Mariana produced several children, most of whom died young. The survivors included Margaret Theresa, who would be married off to her uncle Leopold. Yes, another uncle-niece pairing. And finally, in 1661, a son who would become Charles II. Philip IV died in 1665, leaving behind an empire in decline and a 4-year-old heir whose genetic inheritance would prove to be the most extreme in European royal history. ###Charles II, the Bewitched King. Charles II represents the absolute nadir of royal inbreeding. Born on November 6, 1661, he entered the world already bearing the accumulated genetic damage of 16 generations of cousin marriage. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, higher than that typically seen in the children of siblings. From birth, Charles II was obviously different. French court records described him as a child with herpes-type rashes, a head covered in scabs, and a kind of channel or drainage that oozes from the right ear. There were even rumors that his sexual organs were so malformed that courtiers couldn't initially determine his gender. Charles never learned to walk properly. His legs were weak and malformed, his spine curved unnaturally, and his balance was so poor that he needed constant support. He didn't speak his first words until age 4, and even then his speech was so slurred by his enlarged tongue and malformed jaw that only his closest attendants could understand him. The famous Habsburg jaw reached its grotesque peak in Charles II. His lower jaw protruded so far that he couldn't close his mouth or chew solid food. Meals became ordeals of careful positioning and slow, painful swallowing. Court physicians described watching him eat as distressing to witness. Food would fall from his mouth, and he would struggle for minutes to swallow what others consumed in seconds. Charles's mental capacity was severely limited. He couldn't read or write beyond a basic level, struggled to understand simple concepts, and often seemed confused about where he was or what was happening around him. Contemporary accounts describe him as having the mental development of a young child, even as an adult. The Spanish court gave Charles II the nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because they couldn't understand how someone could be so physically and mentally impaired without supernatural intervention. They subjected him to constant exorcisms and religious ceremonies, believing that evil spirits had possessed him. Charles II married twice, both times to foreign princesses who were horrified by his condition. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, was reportedly so repulsed by his appearance and behavior that she avoided being alone with him. Court observers noted that she would visibly flinch when he tried to speak to her. The marriage produced no children. After Marie-Louise died in 1689, Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg. This second marriage was equally childless. Charles II's impotence wasn't just psychological. His genetic damage had made him physically incapable of reproduction. Charles II died on November 1, 1700, just days before his 39th birthday. His death certificate listed various immediate causes, but the real cause was obvious to anyone willing to see it. He died because 16 generations of his ancestors had chosen genetic purity over human welfare. With Charles II's death, the Spanish Habsburg line came to an end. His will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir, sparking the War of Spanish Succession. But perhaps more importantly, his death ended the most extreme experiment in royal inbreeding that Europe had ever seen. ### the Egyptian pharaohs, where it all began. Long before the Habsburgs made inbreeding infamous, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt had perfected the practice. For over 3 millennia, Egyptian royal families practiced sibling marriage as a religious duty, believing that their divine blood must not be diluted with that of mere mortals. Akhenaten, the heretic king's hidden suffering. Akhenaten ruled Egypt during the 18th dynasty around 1353 to 1336 BCE. He's famous for revolutionizing Egyptian religion, abandoning the traditional pantheon of gods in favor of worshipping only Aten, the sun disk. But Akhenaten's radical religious reforms may have been influenced by the genetic damage that plagued his family. Surviving statues and relief carvings of Akhenaten show a man with distinctly abnormal features. His face was extremely elongated with a pointed chin and sunken cheeks. His neck was unnaturally long and thin, supporting a skull that appeared almost alien in its proportions. His body was equally strange. Thin arms and legs supporting a torso with pronounced breasts and a distended belly that made him appear pregnant. Modern medical experts have proposed several diagnoses for Akhenaten's condition. Erwin Braverman of Yale University suggests that the pharaoh suffered from 2 genetic disorders: aromatase excess syndrome, which would cause his body to convert male hormones to female hormones, and craniosynostosis, which would explain his elongated skull. These conditions would be consistent with the effects of inbreeding. Akhenaten's parents, Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, were likely related, continuing a family tradition that stretched back generations. The genetic damage accumulated in their son manifested not just in physical deformities, but possibly in the religious mania that drove him to completely restructure Egyptian society. Akhenaten married his own sister Nefertiti in keeping with royal tradition, but he also married his daughters, Meritaten and Ankhesimpitan, in unions that produced children so genetically damaged that none survived to adulthood. The royal family's genetic isolation had become so extreme that it could no longer produce viable heirs. Tutankhamun, the boy king's tragic legacy. Tutankhamun, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1332 to 1323 BCE, is one of history's most famous pharaohs, but not for reasons he would have wanted. The discovery of his intact tomb in 1922 revealed not just incredible treasures, but evidence of a young man whose life was defined by genetic suffering. Modern DNA analysis has revealed the truth about Tutankhamun's parentage. His father was Akhenaten and his mother was one of Akhenaten's sisters. This brother-sister union produced a